Okay, so welcome. My name is Dave Dorman, and I am serving as chair today. Our normal chair, Dr. Osberger, is gone right now, so he's asked me to just sit in for him today. So welcome to the Secretary Science Advisory Board meeting. So this will be a virtual public meeting, and what I'd like to just do is call the meeting to order. And then what the next thing I'd like to do is the agenda, as you can see, is posted here on the screen. And so the agenda is calling for us to be actually here until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. My gut feeling is that we may be able to get through the agenda a little bit quicker, but we'll see. And then for those of you that are attending virtually, and which is really everybody today, the board will be taking approximately 1 hour break at about 11:30 to 12:30, and then we'll reconvene at 12:30. So our agenda includes a number of new updates coming from DEQ and DHHS and others. We'll be meeting some new staff along the way as well. And then we'll be trying to provide some feedback in the afternoon session. So without a lot of further ado, what I do want to do is go through the ethics statement. And so in accordance with the State Government Ethics Act, it is the duty of every board member to avoid both conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflict. If any board member has any known conflict of interest or is aware of facts that might create the appearance of such conflict with respect to any matters coming before the board today, please identify the conflict or the facts that might create the appearance of a conflict to ensure that any inappropriate participation in the matter may be avoided. If at any time any new matter raises a conflict during the meeting, please be sure to identify it at that time. And so I'll pause for a few moments to see if there's any members of the board that want to identify a conflict of interest.
Hi, Dr. Dorman. This is Jamie DeWitt. I just want to make some disclosures.
Sure.
So I would like to disclose that I have served and do serve as a plaintiff's expert witness in cases involving PFAS. I'm also a current member of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency PFAS Science Advisory Board. I also am funded to study the toxicity of PFAS.
Okay. Any other conflicts of interest among board members? Okay. All right, if we could go back to the agenda then. And our next item on our agenda is approval of the meeting minutes from our June 6th, 2022 meeting. I'll open it up for discussion if there's any changes that board members feel are needed or warranted in the minutes.
Dr. Dorman, a comment. This is John Vandenberg.
Hi, John.
I think the minutes have been very well done. What would help me is including links to materials that are being referred to in the minutes. So, for example, there was an item in the minutes that referred to the PFAS monitoring statewide, and I actually had trouble finding that. So it would be very helpful if those links could be embedded in the minutes as we go forward. Just a suggestion for now and the future. Thank you. That's my only comment.
Okay, that seems like a reasonable request, but before we maybe act on that, what I'd just like to get a sense of is like what, just so that staff as they're developing the minutes and add the links, what types of specific links are we looking for? Like pretty much anything? Like when we say things like the participation plan is posted on the DHHS website, do we want a link for that?
I would like that, yeah. If it's basically what you just said, if it says it's posted on the website someplace, because websites are fairly complicated and not necessarily intuitive where to find things.
Okay. So starting with today's minutes, we'll try to go ahead and do that moving forward. That seems reasonable.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments? Okay, if I could get a motion and a second to approve the minutes, I'd appreciate that.
So moved. This is Jamie.
Second, this is John Vandenberg.
Okay, any discussion? Okay, we'll do just, guess we could do a roll call vote, although it's a little bit hard for me right now to know exactly who is on the call. And so, I mean, I am looking at the participant list. So maybe what we could just do is go by affirmation. So all those board members in favor of approving the minutes say aye.
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 Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay, so it's been so moved. And by doing it by this way, affirmation and opposed, we should be able to keep track of who said what for the minutes. Okay, so our next item is updates from the board, DEQ and DHHS. And so I think I'll turn it over to state staff to try to give us those updates. I'm not sure we as a board have any updates of note today, other than a few board members are traveling for the summer. And so do we have folks from DEQ that want to give us updates?
Yes, good morning, Dr. Dorman. I will start and then I'll hand it off to our colleagues at DHHS. This is Sushma Mace-Moore, Assistant Secretary for Environment. First, I wanted to welcome Mr. David Howard to the board for serving and providing his time and resources to assist the Secretary's Science Advisory Board. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Sushma. Glad to be here.
So David, maybe do you want to spend a few minutes just talking about your background so we get a chance to know,
You know if you wanted that or not.
who you are and
Yeah. Currently, I am a public health director for New Hanover County down in Wilmington, and I've been here for almost 5 years. Initially as assistant director, and about a year and a half now as director for public health services. Previous to that, I was health director and also HHS agency director up in Bladen County. So that was 15 to 17 or so when we learned about this. So got some experience up there on the ground level, certainly in Bladen County. And previous to that, I was in a smaller county up in the Northeast in Hyde County as health director. Currently doing a lot of work involved in a lot of different levels of Pfast issues, certainly locally around, as you know, in environmental health, public health, environmental health, we permit all the private wells in a county, and that's something of considerable sort of practicality of application of the science at the local level, which is probably why you have me on the board to understand what the ups and downs are and what the local concerns are in terms of county operations and obligations to their citizenry. A lot of discussion here in New Hanover and other counties, I'm sure, is in terms of what we can commit to helping our citizens, either in the interim between now and when they get some type of assistance for protection of their drinking water, but also doing a lot of work arm in arm with Ken and CFPUA, the major drinking water provider here in the county, and others. So working on a lot of different levels around that. Happy to be on the board. Happy to hear from you all also what you would like to hear from me. You know, if you want me to go out and do some info gathering from my perspective, certainly let me know, and I can try to be as great of benefit to the board as possible.
well, I think your perspective will be really valuable, and welcome to the board. What's your educational background, if you don't mind?
So my initial degrees were actually in business, and I have a master's in public health from UNC Greensboro.
Okay.
Oh.
Any questions from our board members for David, other than welcome?
Thank you.
Okay. Sushma, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Dorman. Good morning, members of the board. I will provide a few updates on the federal front, as well as what's happening in North Carolina since our last gathering. I particularly want to cover the latest EPA announcements related to PFAS, including what North Carolina's DEQ's action strategy for PFAS. Bear with me as I have quite a bit of information to share with you, and I'll break it down into a few segments so it's a little easier to follow. So on June 15th, EPA announced lifetime drinking water health advisories for 4 PFAS compounds. The first set are interim lifetime drinking water health advisories for 2 chemicals, PFOA and PFAS. For both of these, EPA is replacing and updating its 2016 health advisories based on new science. The science they cite is based on 400 additional studies that indicate that some negative health effects may occur at water concentrations of PFOA and PFAS that are close to 0. And as a result, the agency has set the interim health advisories for PFOA at 0.004 parts per trillion and for PFAS at 0.02 parts per trillion. Our current analytical methods will not detect PFOA and PFAS at the levels that have been set. So therefore, EPA has set minimum reporting level of 4 parts per trillion, PPT, and that is being used based on instrument measurement and analytical capability. So based on EPA's SAB's final recommendations, I believe that the meeting occurred about 2-3 weeks ago. EPA plans to propose national primary drinking water regulations for PFOA and PFAS this fall, and then issue a final regulation in 2023. The reason these are needed for clean water systems is the health advisories are non-enforceable and non-regulatory, but they're an important aspect of beginning the process for monitoring, for addressing PFAS contamination. I'll take a few moments to talk about what we're seeing in our drinking water sources, as well as groundwater and surface water. We have data from 380 raw water samples in public water systems. This data was collected in 2019 by the Pfast network, and they covered 97 counties. We're based on the data that were presented, detectable PFOA and PFAS measuring greater than 4 parts per trillion were measured in 53 counties. We're targeting these particular locations at first, but our agency has historically not sampled these type of public water systems. So we are in the process of building a sampling protocol to collect and analyze raw and finished water at 50 sources that PFOA and PFAS were detected in 2019 at or above 4 parts per trillion. Our sample collection, measurement, and analysis in concert with the utilities will be conducted over the next 3 months. EPA advises that drinking water systems that detect PFOA and PFAS at these levels should take steps such as informing residents, undertaking monitoring, sampling, and examining steps to limit exposure. And we as our agency are working towards that goal too. Related to discharges to surface water, the board may recall about 6 months ago, we had our regulatory folks provide overviews of water systems discharging into surface water, public water systems, as well as groundwater. As far as surface water data are concerned, we as an agency collected information on PFAS levels in the Kafia River Basin in 2019. And so based on that historical data, we have identified several wastewater systems that may discharge PFOA and PFAS above the reportable levels to downstream water supply sources. Our Division of Water Resource is currently working with the utilities and pretreatment operators to better understand these levels and variability, collect additional information, and take appropriate next steps. The other source of contamination is groundwater systems. As you know, we have an interim maximum allowable concentration for PFOA, and in the state rules, it's set at 2,000 parts per trillion. And this was set in December 2006. About 2 years ago, the board was consulted to help reduce this level to 70 parts per trillion, and this was the EPA's 2016 advisory. Then again, about a year ago, you were consulted whether to consider additional scientific information that pointed to a much lower reference dose. And based on the recommendation you all provided, we halted our rulemaking process to include 70 parts per trillion, because majority of the board members suggested that we should consider the new updated toxicity and health data. EPA's interim health advisory that was just announced in June confirms that, and also supports the review process that we as an agency can undergo with your assistance. In June of 2022, we received a request to withdraw the current IMAC. This is the interim maximum allowable concentration for PFOA that I mentioned is at 2,000 parts per trillion. And that official request documented the EPA's health advisory and additional scientific information for the agency to evaluate removing the existing 2,000 parts per trillion PFOA IMAC. The Division of Water Resources is currently reviewing this request, and we will be coming out with our decision in the coming months. Groundwater data in North Carolina shows that there is PFAS in our network system. You may recall that I mentioned in the last meeting that we have a total of 703 monitoring wells in our network. These are at 234 monitoring stations located in 68 counties. Our division and our department is working towards sampling every one of these wells. And thus far, 217 wells have been tested at 86 locations. Most of these have started in the lower Cape Fear River Basin and we're moving westward. This summer, we will be completing sampling in additional counties, Onslow, Duplin, Cumberland, Bladen, and Robeson counties. And I do realize that you all may have need for access to this information, so we'll provide links to the websites where this data will be posted. I'm going to shift now to X Chemicals. X Chemicals and Pfbs are the two other chemicals that EPA has set final lifetime drinking water health advisories. For X, the health advisory is set at 10 parts per trillion. Franny Nelson, Dr. Nelson will talk about more as to what we're doing related to all of these chemicals in a few minutes. But at a higher level, we have learned that the company that manufactures X in North Carolina at the Fayetteville Works facility has filed a petition for review of EPA's final advisory, questioning the basis for the scientific analysis. And that process will be reviewed in federal court in the coming months and perhaps a year or so. But in the meantime, EPA's health advisory for X of 10 parts per trillion does replace the state's provisional drinking water health goal of 140 parts per trillion that was developed by DHHS with your assistance. Our consent order with Chemours provides public water or whole building filtration excuse me, for any private drinking water well with a X concentration above a health advisory, which is now 10 parts per trillion. So in anticipation of this advisory, we directed Chemours back in November and again in June to provide a plan for providing alternative water for the impacted private well users. We received a response about 2 weeks ago that identified that an additional 1,697 properties in Cumberland, Bladen, and Robeson counties have tested between 10 parts per trillion and 140 parts per trillion. So these are new residences or properties that are now eligible for alternate water supply under the consent order. So Chemours has provided a response, and in that includes a sample letter that they plan to send to the affected homeowners. Our department and divisions are reviewing that letter. And the letter basically will inform the homeowners of 3 options that they have. I won't go into the details of it, but all of this information is is now available on our website, and we'll be sharing that letter also on the website as soon as it's finalized. A significant amount of information will be forthcoming of the feasibility and the timing of public water connections. And at that time, the owners would have the option to select amongst the available choices. We believe that connections to properties may necessitate expansion of public water distribution systems, especially in Cumberland County, where most of the increased properties are noted. These do not have current services, but we're working with the parties to evaluate the options. But now with more properties affected, perhaps the cost per connections may drop into a feasibility range, which were determined to be infeasible before. By September 13th, mid-September, Chemours is required to complete a feasibility study for connections to public water distribution systems. And that report will be due to the department in September. However, meanwhile, private well sampling continues beyond those counties where Chemours is located, and particularly the 4 lower Cape Fear counties that we mentioned in a couple of meetings prior. This includes New Hanover, Columbus, Pender, and Brunswick counties. These counties have been brought into the sampling protocol because of detection of PFAS that are Chemours signature compounds. The company has mailed out thousands of letters to potentially affected homeowners, informing of their well testing options. Of the few hundred that have been tested, 57 wells have detected PFAS from the Table 3 compounds at 10 parts per trillion or above, or a total of 70 parts per trillion. And if anyone needs more information on where they are and which compounds were detected, we're happy to provide that information. I'm going to wrap up a little bit since this is of most important information that most people are looking for. We continue to work with the company on the permitting front. The permit review for the last major contamination area continues. This is the contaminated groundwater system. We held a public hearing on June 21st and 23 related to a 70 feet deep underground barrier wall that'll be about a mile long. The wall, in addition to the groundwater extraction system and its associated treatment system, are part of the permit. There's a hearing officer that is reviewing all the comments received and will be making recommendations to the Director of Water Resources. We plan to issue that findings and the final decision in the coming weeks. I wanted to also say a few things about the air quality related aspects from the Chemours plant. DAQ continues to monitor Chemours activities under the April settlement agreement that you may have heard about. This agreement required the site to meet a new 1.0 pound per month Gen X emissions limit, amongst other things related to a violation that occurred in the previous months. On July 2nd, just a few weeks ago, Chemours reported a leak that resulted in an estimated 1.07 pounds of Gen X emissions on that day. We're reviewing the information provided. We're collecting additional information and are investigating this incident and also the compliance with the new limit I just mentioned. All of this work that I described is some of the ones that we are working on. We have a department-wide and a statewide action strategy that we're implementing related to PFAS. It's basically to guide our actions related to the contamination that we have learned about, that we're continuing to learn about and continue to discover. And in summary, that action strategy, the document is on our website, and we're happy to include that in the meeting notes next time. But it consists of 3 main steps. The first is protecting our communities. And as I mentioned, through the efforts that we're we're doing, our goal is to identify and notify all those who may be at risk of exposure based on the health advisories that are out, based on the scientific information that tells us the risks associated with the PFAS compounds. The second action strategy is related to protecting our drinking water. That includes setting regulatory standards and encouraging and working with the utilities and industries to prevent future PFAS pollution. And then finally, as you know, with Chemours and also several other locations that we've identified, cleaning up existing contamination is our third major action strategy. This includes remediation of sites that are affecting drinking water supplies and other receptors. The last thing I wanted to announce was a joint fellowship program between the DEQ and the Collaboratory. This joint process brings public, private, and institutional collaborative involvement between the academia and our agency. And Dr. DeWitt and Dr. Lee Ferguson will be the first cohorts to participate in this program. And we're really looking forward to their involvement in our agency's work and also for us to learn from them. We have a few projects and activities that we've outlined that are consistent with many of the things that I talked about. Dr. DeWitt and Dr. Ferguson will start in mid-August, late August, and complete their contribution by December. And then we'll have a new cohort start in winter of next year, and then summer of next year. And there's more information on the fellowship announcements on our website too. So with that, thank you for your patience. I know I covered a lot. I'm happy to provide additional information now and later as needed.
Okay, thanks. So I actually had maybe 3 quick questions while the rest of the SAB is thinking about it. So I was curious about the rollout of data. So for example, the well data, how is that actually communicated to, say, public health directors at the county level, impacted individuals? Is it posted on the website? If you could just touch on that briefly. And then I guess a second question maybe I'll ask right now is, as far as public connections to water supplies, the water supplies, do they actually meet the current 10 part per trillion level for Gen X, for example, or is there an issue with actually the public water supplies? For example, if people were to switch from wells to public water, is that an issue here in the state as well? I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Both questions are very good. I'll start with the second one. The Gen X levels at the municipal water supplies that are affected, that'll be serving the affected homeowners in Cumberland County, Bladen County. And I believe that all of them have not detected Gen X above 10 parts per trillion. And I'll let Michael Scott, Director Scott, provide any other information on that.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. This is Michael Scott, Director of Division of Waste Management. Good morning, Dr. Dorman, other members of the SAB. What we have done in the past is, as we work on the availability of municipal water, whether it's in the lower Cape Fear area, New Hanover, and the surrounding counties, or the counties around the Chemours plant, which is actually in Bladen County, when public water is determined to be feasible, we actually share analytical results of that particular municipal water with the homeowner. Under the consent order, homeowners have the option to connect to municipal water or to choose different filtration types. Those 2 filtration types are reverse osmosis or whole house granular activated carbon. So our approach thus far, luckily we see low levels of Gen X in the lower Cape Fear region. But our approach has been, once municipal water is determined to be feasible, we share all of that information, filter options, municipal water connection options with the homeowner, and the latest water quality report for that municipal water system. That way the homeowner has all the information and can make an informed decision. On the data front, we do share that data. Core shares it immediately with the homeowner, meaning preliminary data. Once their private well results are back, about 30 days later, a final results package comes in and is also mailed to the homeowner regarding the analytical data for their private well. We have been sharing through different meetings, even email updates with the local health directors, these private well sampling summaries, and I'm actually due to send another one out this week. We receive updated private well information almost weekly, and so we've been trying to send that information out as often as needed for local officials, at least every few weeks, but we do have regular running list of the analytical data like Sushma referred to. Hope that helps. Thank you.
And Dr. Dorman, your question on public water systems and the groundwater wells data, I'll provide a little update on that. The drinking water systems are monitored and serviced by our public water supply section. And as I said earlier, the data, the monitoring data for that are limited. We're beginning to start a 3-month sampling and analysis process with those drinking water systems in 50 or so counties. 50 or so systems. That information, once it's available, we'll be happy to share with the public. It'll be available on our website. Many of the utilities are already sampling for PFAS, and their information is already available on their websites. And then finally, for the groundwater wells, that will be available on our website. It is currently available now, but the new wells that are sampled out of our AMIT monitoring network will be posted on the website too.
Okay, thank you. And then if the board will bear with me for one more question, and then you'll all wish Tom was back. The fellowship you mentioned, is that competitive, or what is the selection process that DEQ has set up? Is that like, do you have a peer review process for selection of the fellows, or can you spend a moment or two talking about that?
Well, it was an idea between our leadership and the Collaboratory leadership. Initially, it was meant, or potentially we thought the interest would be from students. We have an MOU between the two groups that basically identifies the overall intent of information sharing, collaborative nature of our work. It is not competitive. It is based on interest level as submitted by the participants in the Collaboratory towards this joint partnership.
Okay. Okay, any questions, other questions from board members?
This is Detlef. I have a couple, if I may.
Sure.
One question is about the choice of the 4 nanogram per liter reporting limit, which I understand is the reporting limit associated with UCMR 5, the 5th unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. But many labs report 2 or even lower, and so I'm curious, what guidance are you providing to utilities, drinking water providers that may have reported values above the reporting limit of the lab, but below 4 nanograms per liter?
It's a really good question, Dr. Knabe. I think we are in the process of working out that particular question. Our DWR rules require labs to be certified. We're looking into the process needed to certify those labs that would be analyzing for these compounds using the EPA methods. We'd like to, receive your feedback on that. I'm not prepared to answer that question right now, but we do plan talking with EPA about that some labs are able to measure with appropriate accuracy and precision on those compounds at less than 4, and we've heard 2 parts per trillion. And it's something that we're trying to figure out as we certify these labs, is that available with confidence or not?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I think the 4 nanograms per liter is really quite conservative that EPA chose for UCMR 5. You know, the many labs are routinely reporting 2 and often even below 2 for PFOA and PFOS. The other question I had was related to the choice of public water connection as an alternative source for people with impacted private wells. And my understanding is that, you know, if the public water is derived from the Cape Fear River, then PFOA and PFOS levels can, at least on occasion, exceed 4 nanograms per liter. And I'm just curious whether that's clearly communicated to the homeowners who are needing to make decisions.
Yeah, again, that's a really good point. Yes, that part of the communication is going to be important. We do recognize that, and transparency towards that choice that the homeowner can make and will make is important. So we'll do our best to communicate not only the level of PFAS in their water, but if they choose to connect to the municipal supply, what the data tells us as to the level of PFAS in their water.
Okay, thank you.
Any other board members? Questions, comments, suggestions?
This is John Vandenberg.
Or John?
Thank you very much. That's a very helpful overview, and I'm currently looking at the public briefings that EPA provided back in June that you summarized very nicely, Sushma. But I think the question I have is, as you're expanding the survey of monitoring wells right now, are all individuals that have individual wells being notified of what their levels are, or is it just those that are above the 4 parts per trillion that are being notified?
So the private wells that are being tested are under the Comores consent order. And if it's okay, I'm going to have Director Scott come back regarding what information is provided after their wells are tested.
Yes, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Yes, so when the private wells are sampled under the consent order, the 12 PFAS that are, we call them signature compounds associated with the Comores plant in Bladen County are tested for. Those 12 trigger alternate water provisions if any of them are found above 10 part per trillion or a summation of those above 70 part per trillion or nanogram per liter. If those levels
Uh-oh, I think we lost him.
I think we lost him.
I think in summary, I'll try to fill in. He knows a lot more than I do. Each homeowner gets a summary report of what was detected in their wells, and I think there is an interpretation sheet that helps them understand what the data is showing. We're also available. All this is done by a private contractor, by Comores, to help them make sense of the report for their well.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Other questions from the board? Okay, Sushma, thank you.
Thank you. And one of the last thing I'll add is Dr. Nielsen's presentation builds on this information, and we look forward to further conversations as we move forward. Thank you.
Okay. So who's our next person to give an update? you can tell how well coordinated this is. So hopefully someone else is going to be giving us an update on DHHS or others.
Yes. Hi, Dr. Dorman. This is Dr. Kim Gates. I'm with NCDHHS, and I'll be giving the update in lieu of Dr. Zach Moore and Dr. Virginia Guidry are both away today. And first of all, I'd like to thank you all for having me here. I'm the epidemiology supervisor with the Occupational and Environmental Epidemiology branch. And I'd also like to welcome David Howard from New Hanover County and thank him for his partnership on PFAS since the beginning, including in Bladen County as well as New Hanover County. I'd also like to welcome, we have several new staff members ourselves. We'd like to welcome Josh Lohman as our new health assessment, consultation, and education, HACE is the program name, supervisor. And Wayne Spoo is our new environmental program consultant for the HACE program as well. And so now that program is back to being fully staffed, and we're very pleased about that. We'd also like to welcome an informatics fellow, Robert Cockrell, whose first day is today, and he is from the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists. And he'll be working to coordinate data flows between the State Center for Health Statistics and our branch for the development of the Environmental Health Data Dashboard, which is now live. And I will be able to put the link. We have our beta version available on our website. I think we mentioned that last time in the update, and so this time it is live and available for sharing. North Carolina was also awarded a grant from CDC to be able to become part of the National Environmental Public Health Tracking Network. And that funding period starts today. So we're excited about that announcement as well. On the PFAS front, we are supporting our ongoing efforts that are mentioned by DEQ and working in close partnership with them. We're also in the process of reviewing the guidance on PFAS exposure testing and clinical follow-up that was just released from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And we're also updating our PFAS and GenX websites and our provider memo based on feedback from a publication with, I believe Dr. DeWitt was one of the co-authors. And so we appreciate that feedback and that overview of all of the health communications between all of the states. Lastly, Kennedy Holt will be giving an update later on the fish collection and processing that's in progress in coordination with DEQ, NCWRC, and then us. We're still working on the environmental justice front. Dr. Guidry is working on the North Carolina Clean Transportation Plan, including participation on the medium and heavy duty vehicle committee. And the public participation plan has been drafted and posted. And that is Executive Order 246, Section 8, that refers to. Our BRACE program, which is our climate change program, has developed a climate impact compendium and is working to finalize that to identify climate projections, current and potential health impacts, affected systems, and adaptive capacity in North Carolina to inform future climate and health work. And then our private well and health program has received funding, a notice of award for funding for year 2, which includes a pilot project to geolocate wells and septic systems in low social vulnerability index census tracts in southeastern North Carolina, and that is in collaboration between our branch and also the Environmental Health Services Division of DHHS. Lastly, our North Carolina COVID wastewater monitoring network has also started monitoring monkeypox as well. There have been no detections so far at any sites, but we continue to monitor that alongside COVID-19 as well.
Okay, thank you. I saw
those are all right.
Wayne has joined us on the call, so I think we were going to provide an opportunity for your new staff to introduce themselves. So maybe, Wayne, if you want to say hello to the SAB, and then I don't know if the other folks you mentioned are actually available. I was trying to look through names and did not see them, but I saw Wayne.
Sure, I can give a brief introduction. My manager, Josh Lumen, is out on leave this week, so he was not able to attend. But my name is Wayne Spoo. I'm a veterinary toxicologist. Been in toxicology for about 33 years. Started off in inhalation toxicology, where I did my postdoctoral research, and then came to North Carolina State University College of Veterinary Medicine, doing bench research, and spent a number of years, probably 27 years, in the private sector corporate toxicology area. One of those things in my days in the contract research business at RTI International, I was a principal author for a number of the ATSDR toxicology profiles. So that was covering some very interesting work there. I just recently joined the DHHS back in May. Doing most of my time is on Pfast toxicology, and look forward to learning a lot more about Pfast and the impact it's having on North Carolina and the country as well. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Kim, I had a couple of questions. And so one does kind of relates to the National Academy report, in which they're advocating that physicians and others consider having patients tested for exposures to PFAS compounds. One of the challenges I think a lot of clinicians have is, one, not always knowing whether they should actually have someone tested, but the other part is, where do they send samples? And so it didn't appear, looking at the DHHS epidemiology website right now for PFAS compounds, there's no mention about, at least I don't see it quickly, about how an individual or a physician could get samples tested and what laboratories would accept samples. Can you maybe expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know if Kennedy Holt, are you available? He's been working on the website, so I think they may be adding some information for laboratories that are available for testing. And from what I remember, the state laboratory is also hoping to gain the capability soon to do that testing, but I'll let Kennedy say more about that.
Yeah, so I know what you are referring to, Dr. Dorman, and as before the National Academies came out with their report, we had been looking at incorporating guidance that had been put out by a group, PFAS Reach. It's a group that is coordinated with the NIEHS and other entities to put out information for clinicians, including continuing education materials for clinicians. And part of their materials in terms of one, providing guidance to both clinicians and patients in terms of getting information for their how to respond to PFAS exposures, but part of that is also providing information on labs that can conduct PFAS testing, both labs where people can request sample kits that are sent to them and then sent them back to labs, and then also ones that can be done in a clinical setting as well, both blood tests that can sample from multiple PFAS. So as Kim said, as far as updating a provider memo, that is one thing we've been working on in order to take a lot of this information and try to condense it a little bit down. So because the National Academy reports and some of these other information sources are pages long, and we're happy to provide those documents as well and links to them when we get that ready to go. But we also want to provide kind of a more quicker and easier read for the public. So we've been working on trying to pare that down while also not diluting the information there. But yes, that is something we are considering and are incorporating into our materials.
Okay, thanks. I mean, the press release might be a good place to start as you're looking at paring down the report. I mean, that's just throwing that out for what it's worth. And then I guess I had one other question which relates to the PACT Act, which did not get passed by this US Senate, but there does appear to be some likelihood that some version of the PACT Act will eventually pass. And given the number of veterans here in North Carolina that may be impacted by that, that maybe it's just something like, to what extent is DHHS trying to keep track of what expanded roles either DHHS might have, or working with VA and others if the PACT Act actually is passed? And that's the Burn Pit Act. That's what it gets called, although it's broader than that.
Yeah, I have not been involved in discussions around that. I'm not sure if Kennedy or Dr. Tilson knows anything more about that. I'm familiar with the one that you're speaking of, but I'm not quite sure.
Okay. I mean, it just may be something worth putting on the radar, so to speak, of DHHS, because it, I mean, could be a very extensive act if and when it does get passed. So any other questions or comments from board members for Kim and her staff? Okay, well, seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so that pretty much gives us our updates. And I'm just checking time. We're doing pretty well. And so, Franny, you're on the agenda next as far as your presentation.
I am. I just need permission to share my screen and then I can get started.
Yes, you should have your, you should be able to present now. Everything looked good.
Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. For anyone that doesn't know me, my name is Franny Nilsson. I am the environmental toxicologist at the Department of Environmental Quality. Today, I'm going to give a brief overview of the way that the DEQ is looking at the latest EPA PFAS values and how we are working to implement them. So this slide might look familiar. I've used it several times at this point, but these are the top 20 PFAS or so in North Carolina. And then this second slide has them separated into the PFAS compounds that the EPA roadmap is going to be tackling. And then on the right side are the PFAS compounds that the EPA will not be dealing with. The very light green are the CMOR's signature or the consent order compounds, and then the darker green are the legacy PFAS. These pink colors are the PFAS that the EPA currently has a reference dose for. And so these four are the ones that I'm going to be talking about for the next couple minutes. This table shows these 4 PFAS again, along with their reference dose in milligrams per kilograms per day, and then also listed with their EPA lifetime drinking water health advisory in parts per trillion. And so I recently presented at a drinking water symposium, and there was some confusion about a reference dose. And so I just wanted to take a minute for any members of the public that are listening to hash out what a reference dose is. A reference dose is a number that the EPA or any other agency will derive based on toxicological data from animals and a lot of different studies. A lot of different data is required to derive a reference dose. This data is then put into an equation based on whatever health outcome or detrimental effect they're looking at, and that's usually known as a point of departure. That concentration is put into an equation and it is kind of walked back to a human equivalency dose, and then a dose or a concentration that would be safe for a human to drink for their entire lifetime. And so a reference dose is the dose you can be exposed to forever and nothing should happen to you. And that is often why it is used in a lot of these different equations, but a reference dose is not the concentration at which bad things occur. The EPA's lifetime drinking water health advisory is a similar situation, but not quite the same. These are health advisories to give us information on contaminants that can cause health effects and are known or anticipated to occur in drinking water. And so these concentrations are also quite low, and while they are non-enforceable and non-regulatory, these do include a lot of information on detection and analytical capabilities, coupled with that concentration you can be exposed to for a lifetime without any negative effects occurring. And so you may have seen this slide before as well, or remember it. I know you've seen it before. Reference doses are really important in a lot of the standards development that North Carolina does. And so the 3 listed here at the bottom of this figure are DEQ's groundwater, surface water, and drinking water rules, and a reference dose is required for all 3. To take a closer look at this, as far as our groundwater calculations or our 2L rules, we can calculate this particular rule the way it is written, it is currently in existence based on the reference dose. The surface water calculation is a little more complicated, and we need information on what are called BCFs. It's a bioconcentration factor. And I'm going to explain that a little deeper in a second. And then finally, our drinking water calculation requires a lot more information to be gathered before we can add anything to the rules. And so we need to do a physical and technological assessment, which is a lot more complicated than the other 2. Now, a bioconcentration or a bioaccumulation factor, so the abbreviation is BCF or BAF, they're essentially the same thing. One is indicative of being measured in a lab, the other is indicative of being measured in the environment. And so these are really just indicators of a chemical's tendency to accumulate in a living organism. They can be calculated using either empirical data, so direct measurements, or mathematical modeling data. This is something that can just be expressed as a ratio of a concentration in an organism and then a concentration in the environment. This shows us the extent of chemical sharing between the organism and its environment, so the sharing or the accumulation between the environmental compartments. And then a number greater than 1 is indicative of accumulation. And so essentially a ratio greater than 1 means there is the potential for accumulation. These require, like I said, either environmental measurements or modeling data. And the EPA has actually assessed a lot of PFAS and PFOA bioconcentration data for their draft aquatic life criteria they've recently published. And this is an area that the SAB can help us with to assess this data and determine if any of the values included in this report are appropriate for North Carolina based on species and environmental parameters. Just for future reference, when this presentation is published on our website, this is a screenshot of the top of the fact sheet from the EPA, but there's also a link embedded in there, so if you click it, you'll be taken to the fact sheet on the EPA's website. As far as what is in the aquatic life criteria, this is a screenshot from one of the tables, and there's actually a ton of data in these criteria documents. It's really impressive, and they've put it together in such a great way. This is just one screenshot of one of the 3 pages of mussel data, but it's organized by tissue species and location. And so if you look at the columns, you can see all of that information. And then it also provides the bioaccumulation factor, the log bioaccumulation factor, which is another metric that's used in this kind of equation, as well as a quality ranking of the data, which is really important. And so a big part of what the EPA does when they revise IRIS values or they put out a new tox assessment is they go through this very rigorous evaluation of data quality. And the fact that they're providing that information to us is really great, and it means that we don't have to do quite as rigorous of an assessment because it has been done and the information is provided to us. There's also all the reference information, so we can look back into the original publications and see where the data is coming from. And so where am I going with this? The proposed next steps for what DEQ is going to do is basically evaluate these aquatic life criteria, bioaccumulation values, and data, and figure out which is appropriate for North Carolina. So the first step, DEQ is going to sort through all of this data and determine which species and locations are appropriate for consideration within North Carolina. And so this is kind of the first pass, like species and location or environment in terms of climate or anything like that. What is applicable to North Carolina? The second step is that we at DEQ will compare the environmental parameters of this smaller list of locations to determine really which of these more specific locations are actually applicable. And so this is a deeper look at the environmental parameters of those locations, including salinity, temperature, dissolved oxygen, trophic web dynamics, etc. A more comprehensive assessment of that specific location and publication. And then finally, DEQ will synthesize all of this information and we will present it to the Science Advisory Board. And then the Science Advisory Board will help us come to a recommendation of a value or a range of values that we can use to propose surface water standards and conduct this big fiscal assessment that we need to move forward in the other rulemaking processes or proceedings. And all of this progress we will present at the October meeting. So stay tuned. This is underway now, and we are hoping to get a lot of this done in the next month or so. And so I'm looking forward to digging into this data and then talking about it with all of you soon. But that is it for this presentation. So short and hopefully sweet, but I can take any questions if there are any. I know there were also a few members of the public that signed up to make comments about this particular presentation. So maybe they're with us now. I'm not sure. I can't see the meeting anymore.
Well,
Sure.
Fran, let's at least, I'm a little bit concerned about doing all the public comments right now with respect to this because, you know, we do have the agenda, and so some people may be coming in closer to the, towards the end of the meeting. But let me just ask board members if there's any questions right now for Franny. Okay, I don't see any. I guess one question just as a strategy, as you're looking at the biology data, are you kind of segregating it by like filter feeders, like their ecological niche, prioritizing it? And how do you actually plan on prioritizing it for your October presentation to the board?
That's a great question. And so as far as I've gotten so far is I've narrowed it down to species and locations that are, you know, at least somewhat applicable to North Carolina. And so I haven't sorted them out by their trophic web status or where they're feed, but I think that's definitely a consideration, and that would have a lot to do with the way that the PFAS are accumulating and what their bioaccumulation factors are. So that's definitely something I will include and present, but I haven't looked at that very deeply yet.
Okay. Well, Franny, did you prefer to deal with public comments now? I mean, we're about a half an hour ahead of schedule, and so I have the list of people that have signed up for public comments, but it's not clear which, if any, are actually associated with your presentation, or maybe you know something I don't know.
So when the public signs up, we ask them to just select an agenda item that they're referring to try to organize their comments a bit better. And I know that Dr. Augsburger was soliciting those comments after presentations to try to make it, I guess, more applicable. And so the comments didn't end up kind of in the nebulous at the end of the meeting. But I think you're right that not everyone is present that has signed up to speak. And
I mean,
so
like right
either
now,
way.
we have 3 people signed up to make comments on DEQ and EPA PFAS values, but I don't know that they're all actually here on the call.
I think Laura has said that they are not, and so we can just table it until later. I just wanted to provide the opportunity. If anyone was
No
there.
worries.
Yes, I can confirm as well that those who had wished to speak are currently not in the meeting.
Okay, great.
Dave, this
So-
is Tom Starr.
Go ahead, Tom.
I have one question for Franny. I
Sure.
was struck by your slide presentation of the RFDs and the drinking water health advisories. Could you pull that up again
Sure.
for Gen X, PFBS, PFOS, and PFOA?
That's one.
Yeah. If you just looked at the range of health advisory values for those 4 groups, it's over a 500,000-fold difference between the most potent and the least potent.
Yes.
And I can't tell by looking at the reference doses offhand, counting zeros, if that's the same range of reference doses or not.
Bigger.
In other words,
-4 to -9, so it's a 5
it's about the same.
place. Yeah.
Okay, so the adjustment factors that went in converting a reference dose to a drinking water health advisory are about the same across those groups.
I believe so.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
May I make a comment real quickly? This is Jamie DeWitt. So I just wanted to note that the critical effect for each of these reference doses varies. So for PFOS and PFOA, the critical effect was suppression of vaccine responses from epidemiological studies. The critical effect for Gen X was liver histopathology in maternal mice from a developmental toxicity study. And I believe, and I haven't looked at it as recently, that the critical effect for PFBS was kidney effects. Franny, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that.
I believe so. Yeah, it was kidney.
So I think, these vary because of the critical effects upon which they were based, but there also are some differences in the uncertainty factors that then lead to these differences in the final degrees. I don't know if there's been any comprehensive studies done to evaluate the potency of these 4 compounds on a single effect, but I would like to share a paper that just came out in Environmental Health Perspectives from RIVM, which is the Dutch equivalent of the EPA. This group evaluated internal serum concentrations of several PFAS chemicals and determined that on an internal serum concentration level for liver weight increases, there were some surprising outcomes. So I'll share that paper with everybody. The first author is Bill, and it came out, I think, just last week in Environmental Health Perspectives.
Oh, that's right.
Surprising in what way?
Well, those PFAS that we tend to regard as having a more favorable toxicological profile, somebody else's words, not mine, because they are shorter in chain length with regard to carbons. were actually more potent than some of the longer chain compounds in inducing liver weight increases on an internal concentration basis. Dr. Dorman, would you like me to share the link to the paper in the chat?
No,
I believe it's
just,
open access.
let's, sure, if it's open access, that'd be fine.
Okay, I'll do that.
That'll also make it easier for the minutes to capture it.
Great.
Thank you.
So Franny, you're scheduled for after lunch to give another presentation on consent order toxicity studies. Do you have a sense of about how long that will be?
It shouldn't be more than 20 minutes, 15 or 20 minutes. It's maybe a couple more slides than this one, but not too many more.
So would you be prepared to do it now, or were you going to prepare it over lunch?
I can do it now.
So if you do it now, then we could, lunch may end up being a little bit shorter than a full hour, but then rather than have dead time right now, why don't you go ahead and present that now? And then we'll break for lunch and then come back for the board feedback.
Sure. All right. Is it sharing my screen properly? I think so.
Yep,
Yes,
looks
it is.
good.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is the next presentation that I'm giving. I'm just going to do a kind of a brief overview of the consent order paragraph that talks about the toxicity studies and what the status of them currently is. Okay, so just a little bit of background. The consent order, for anyone that doesn't know, was signed in February of 2019 between DEQ, the Cape Fear River Watch, which was represented by the Southern Environmental Law Center, and Chemours, and this was all entered into in Bladen County. The enforceable order requires Chemours to address PFAS sources and contamination at the facility to prevent further impacts to air, soil, groundwater, and surface water sources. One of, I think, the lesser known paragraphs of the consent order is paragraph 14, and this is the one that references toxicity studies. And so this text here, I'm not going to read to you, but this is the official text from the consent order, and it'll be here for your reference when this is posted. But essentially that the Chemours is required to do these toxicity studies on the 5 PFAS that are in attachment B, which I'll show you in a second. And DEQ is going to review the protocols before any work gets started. This is attachment B of the consent order. So this is a screenshot right from the document. And the table at the top shows the 5 PFAS that are required to be included in these toxicity studies. Further down the slide, you can see there's an outline. It says toxicity studies and then ecotox studies. And these are all of the studies that are required based on the consent order. These are also required to be conducted following EPA or OECD protocols as defined by the Toxic Substances Control Act or the Office of Pesticides Protection, I can't remember what the other letter stands for, or other appropriate programs as determined by DEQ. And so DEQ is very involved in the review of this work and making sure that everything that is going to happen provides data we can use and also that the rest of the concerned community can use. So again, here's the slide that for better or worse, I've just been using. And so again, on the one side, we've got all of the EPA PFAS roadmap compounds, and then on the right side are the ones the EPA is not tackling, separated by the consent order in light green and legacy in dark green. And then here in black are the consent order compounds. And so these are the 5 compounds that are required by paragraph 14 of the consent order to be included in these toxicity studies. And so it is a naphthalene byproduct 2, and not all of the naphthalene byproducts, but it is one of the few that we know about. And then also PFMOAA, which you might remember from some conversations in our June meeting, followed by PMPA, PPA, and PFO2HXA. Now, as far as the details of this study, and so again, this is the text from the document, and then in these black boxes, I just have a quick summary, so you don't have to continually read the lengthy text. The toxicity studies are these classic tox studies, and so these are rodent toxicity studies. And for both of these, we'll be using mouse and rat species. The classic tox studies are 90-day repeated oral dose toxicity studies, and then the 28-day are oral immunotoxicity studies. Each of those are occurring in mouse and rat. The aquatic toxicity studies, or the ecological toxicity studies, are being conducted in algae, zooplankton, fish, and then worms in the sediment. And so it's a lot of different environmental compartments are going to be tested, and all of these are relevant to bioconcentration factors, and then also understanding how these compounds move in the environment. As far as our current status, this might actually be a very quick presentation now that I'm saying it out loud. The current status of the consent order and our toxicity study review and approval process is here. And I tried to make this timeline very simple, just so it's easy to look at. And so I'll orient you. The teal is the aquatic toxicity dates and landmark that we've had. And then the light purple or pinkish color are the rodent studies. And then so these are all separated. These 4 black boxes are the 4 drafts that we've reviewed at this point. And so you can see the first draft. We've started this process in December of 2020 and went through first draft revisions for both of the rodent and aquatic tox studies in 2021. And this is a very simplified version of this. We've had many meetings and conversations with Chemours throughout each of these draft processes, and that's why there are so many different months listed. The second draft for each, we also went through in different points in 2021. And then also the rodent conversations moved into March of 2022. Since 2022 started, we've been mostly addressing the aquatic toxicity protocols. And so in February of 2022, we received some revised protocols from Chemours, and based on those revisions, DEQ was able to approve the algae and fish toxicity protocols. That happened in April of this year. So 2 of the 5 have been approved thus far. Just say 2 weeks ago, we received a revised version of the remaining 3 protocols, so both plankton and the sediment worm protocols from Chemours, and they are currently under review. And so that is the status of the aquatic tox protocols. The rodent protocols are more detailed and complicated, and they do take a lot longer to review and then revise. And I will say that we have had a lot of external guidance and support from experts in the different fields to help us through this process. So it's not DEQ alone, particularly when we've given the okay to approve. We have consulted external experts in fish toxicology or algae and plankton toxicology. And then there have been 2 separate experts we've conferred on with the immunotox and also the classic tox for the rodent experiments. Here's another look at all of this. And so as far as our aquatic tox study status, 2 of these protocols have been approved, and we are just in the process of reviewing the revision for the last 3. And so hopefully we'll be able to approve those soon, but it will be based on whether or not the specific requirements from our last conversation and the required revisions being made and met. As far as the rodent protocols, here's just another look. And so we required revisions on all of these, and we have not yet received these updated protocols, but I'm expecting them soon, and I'm looking forward to reviewing them, and then also consulting with our experts that have been a great help to this process, certainly. Okay, here's the timeline and what we kind of plan to do moving forward. And so for August, myself and some of the other toxicology staff will be reviewing these revised protocols for the plankton and the sediment worm toxicity experiments, and hopefully approving them based on the edits that were made. And then from September to the end of the year, I'm really going to try to get these rodent protocols back in circulation and in the review process to potentially approve them and hopefully get those things started, or at least in the queue at the contract lab by the end of the year. But it's just planned, and hopefully that comes to fruition. But we'll have to wait and see. So that's it. That's another short and hopefully sweet presentation, but I can take any questions if anyone has any.
Okay, Franny. So this, Dave, so these are drinking water studies?
No. These are toxicity studies, and they're oral administered studies, but they're not based on drinking water.
So they're oral gavage?
Yes.
Okay.
And so I have been in contact with the scientists at the National Toxicology Program, and I've been advocating for them to do a drinking water analogous study with rodents, and the drinking water constituents that the people in North Carolina are exposed to. I know that was met with some enthusiasm and some apprehension, and so I know that they are in the process of designing some toxicology mixtures tox studies, but I have not had a chance to actually review what they've sent me yet. Not that they're waiting for my approval. They're doing it based on their own needs and their own program. But right now they're doing more legacy mixtures as far as I know.
Okay. And are analytical methods well established for these?
So I know that there are a lot of different contract labs that, the methods for these toxicology studies is what you're asking.
Yeah, for the analytical.
Yes. And so the labs that Chemours is using are very well-known third-party labs. And so they're using Eurofins for the aquatic tox studies and then Charles River for the rodent tox studies. And these are, very high quality and well-known labs. And I trust that the people there are going to be doing what they should. We're reviewing the protocols to make sure everything is above the board and we can stand behind these studies. But I am hesitant to think that either one of those contract labs would risk their reputation doing science. It is not good.
Just a general question. So other questions from board members?
Franny, thank you. Just a quick, maybe not go into too much detail, but for the rodent studies, are they including multiple doses to enable a dose response calculation?
Yes, they are. And I can't remember the spread of the doses offhand. But yeah, the dose concentrations and the range of doses is a big conversation point during our meetings.
Okay. And when you say classic toxicity testing, do those include repro, developmental tests?
I know that we are advocating for that currently. I know there's a lot of different endpoints that they are looking at and willing to look at. I can't recall what the protocol stated exactly about that the last time we requested revisions, but I'm hopeful that the revised protocol will include some of that.
And it's just something to consider because the duration of exposure is different for those studies. So thank you very much.
Franny, did the consent order actually specify like which OECD guidelines or EPA guidelines would be followed in the design? Because that would also tell you what endpoints are likely to be included, right?
Right. And so I believe there were some specifics listed, and then we've been going back and forth with Chemours and the contract labs about which ones are more appropriate based on the information we have now, based separately from the information we had 4 years ago. And they've been malleable, I think is maybe the right word. They're definitely open to considering other protocols, and I actually sent them the National Toxicology Program 90-day guidelines for their studies. That way, any of these rodent studies, hopefully that Chemours and Charles Overdue would be comparable to some of the mixtures toxicology that the National Toxicology Program is doing. And they were receptive to that particular document as well. So I'm looking forward to their revision.
All right. Other questions or comments?
This is Elena. I had a question in regards to, how are they going to do the dose range finding? Because from personal experience with PFAS compounds, I know that two big things that come up are use of what vehicle you use for an oral gavage study, and establishing doses for 90-day studies based on tolerability or shorter term studies. Is that part, do you have some pre-testing built into these protocols that will address those issues?
Yes, and so range finding of the proper doses is a big part of the protocols, and that's kind of the first step. Once the protocols are approved, then they do the range finding studies before the final dosing regime is agreed upon. If you're willing to look at these protocols, I would love to have your opinion on them, and I could send them to you.
Absolutely, no problem.
Okay, thank you, I will.
Okay, others? All right, Franny, you got us right back on schedule. It's 11:28 by my clock. So good job. And we've taken care of item 9 for this afternoon. So what we're going to do is take a 1-hour break and reconvene at 12:30. And then before we go, Dylan, do you prefer that people exit and then relog back in? What's your preference? Or just mute and stop videos and just leave us stay on the, what's your preference?
I would recommend staying in the meeting and muting and turning off your video.
Okay. All right, so that's what we'll do. We'll come back in approximately an hour or so. Okay, so see everyone at 12:30. Thank you. Meeting. I guess my biggest comment when I was reviewing the questions was they proved to be quite technical as far as, really kind of a very technical set of questions as opposed to how generally might they be used for setting regulatory values or other purposes for DEQ. So I'll let you maybe just prompt us with what you're hoping for feedback. And Annie, you might be, or Franny, you might be muted.
I am. Sorry. So I'll just share the slide again as well, just so everyone can see. So these are the two questions that we posed to the board in the June meeting. And Dr. Dorman, you're right. They are pretty technical. I went back through the papers and read them and tried to answer the questions myself. And I found that I was having a technical battle with the papers. And I think what DEQ was really looking for was just a review of both of these papers, and they are quite different. But we were looking to see really what your thoughts on them were. Were these high enough quality studies that we could use them in some kind of reference dose derivation in the future? And then are these two papers enough to do this now? And I know a lot of the different metrics of measuring high, moderate, or low quality include sample size or endpoints measured and things like that. And so they don't, I feel like the feedback doesn't need to be so specific, but really just what the members' thoughts on the papers were, and if they are of high enough quality to include at some point, and if we could do this now based on just these 2 papers.
And the 2 papers are Hulk et al. 2021, correct? And then I was trying to go back and looking at, and then the Woodliff, correct?
Yes, I'm trying to find the PowerPoint director here so I can.
Because there was also a 3rd paper, Yao et al. From 2020 that was also circulated with the email at the time. So I just want to make sure we're on the same page with respect to the 2 papers you're talking about.
Yes, so it is Woodliff et al. 2021 and Yao et al. I think 2020. Yes. These are the 2 papers. And then the computational toxicology paper was for discussion, but since I didn't get a lot of feedback about what we wanted the EPA to address, I've just kind of tabled that presentation to a later meeting.
Okay, because in our homework that was circulated before, there was a number of questions that related to the Hulk et al. Paper. So just,
yeah,
those were the questions. So you want to just table that completely?
Yeah, and so I only got responses from I think 2 board members just about a week ago, and so I didn't want to solicit a presentation from the EPA if I wasn't sure exactly the information the board members wanted to hear. So I mean, we can address it at a later date. I was hoping for a presentation during the October meeting. But I think we can have a conversation about the questions about that paper over email, and then we can figure out exactly who at the EPA would be most appropriate to give a presentation to the board and address their concerns about the model and about the whole kind of new approach methodology area of toxicology, if that's okay.
That sounds fine. So I'll open it up. If you go back and post your questions that you had. And then we'll maybe open it up to the board to see what responses or comments that they have.
I've got a few comments. Is this a good time to?
Sure.
So I raised the point at the last meeting as to the role of the board versus the role of the state staff. And I went through the questions and reworked it to make it be questions for the state staff to review the papers and provide their evaluation of it for the board to refine or comment on or approve or accept, versus having us go through that process, each of us individually, to provide comments on the papers themselves. So I'm trying to figure out what the balancing point is. And when we talked about this in June, it seems that in the past, it's gone both ways, that the board has reviewed the science and created a report, provided it to the state, or the board has reviewed what the state has produced and provided recommendations about any changes or essentially approval of that. So I would just like to put that on the table again, because to me, I would rather have the state go through it and have us provide comments as to the state's evaluation rather than have us do the assessment, have the state do the assessment and have us in a review capacity. So that's my point.
Okay, others from the board?
Yeah, this is Tom Starr.
Tom.
I just have some general questions or comments about both papers. And maybe this would be a good place perhaps for the state to start. The detailed questions were sort of beyond my level of expertise in these matters, so I will defer. But these 2 questions up on the board now are general enough for me to comment in, I think, meaningfully. And what's interesting about that is that the authors themselves actually address these questions. For example, the second one, which is basically what we're trying to get to at some point down the road, that question is addressed specifically by both sets of authors in both papers, the Houck and the Woodley papers. I'll call your attention to a couple quotes. First, in the Houck paper on page 14, in the last paragraph, while they're describing their study and the results of it, they say such information can be used to rank and prioritize chemicals for more detailed evaluation, including traditional toxicity testing. So it seems like more would be needed at this point beyond what has been presented in this paper. They also say the use of NAMs can efficiently provide information useful for elucidating mechanism and prioritizing chemicals for potential hazard evaluation, which is the first step in the risk assessment process. So again, this material is useful, but it seems to fall short of providing sufficient information to conduct a quantitative risk assessment. And in particular, if we're being asked to stretch the results of this study and the Houck study onto chemicals that were not part of the library to begin with, and for which we have little or no data at all, they also say that their study is a timely example of the limitations of traditional toxicological approaches in anticipating potential adverse effects of chemicals on humans and the environment. So it seems to me that the authors themselves are humble and not overreaching in terms of what the implications of this study are, and that it needs to be supplemented with additional information that would include traditional toxicity testing. And to stretch to something that's not in the library, you would need this study duplicated for those chemicals or added to the library in some way with data that we don't have yet, and then continue on with traditional toxicity testing, get to the possible hazard evaluation that would come from it. So my answer to the question number 2, which is the key one as far as I can see, is no. They don't provide enough information on the face of it for deriving a reference dose now, and maybe not until quite a bit of supplementary information is gathered that takes us farther down the path. Now, the same may be said for the Woodley paper. I was struck by the fact that almost every endpoint this paper did an assessment of was negative for effects. And despite its excellent design and the comprehensiveness of the endpoints that were evaluated, only one endpoint basically was shown to be significantly different from the values that it showed in the control animals. And that was the shift in the populations of some of the immune system cells, natural killer cells, and perhaps some others. And for that specific finding, what the authors say in their discussion is the following: without concomitant changes in immune functional changes and without clear dose responsivity of these changes in immunophenotype, the meaning of these shifts are challenging to interpret. So they don't know quite what to make of them themselves. How are we as an independent science advisory board that really doesn't know much about this going to go beyond that? I don't know. They talk about possibilities here. The changes could cause perturbations in normal physiology, change the shorter or longer exposure durations findings, but we don't know. And again, in their conclusions, they found these significant shifts in immune cell populations, but the data suggests to them only that PFEAs at the doses administered have toxicological potential and require additional studies to determine their health effects via drinking water exposure. So for me, the bottom line is that both of them, by their author's admission, fall short of providing what it is we would need to go forward. And I'll just leave it right there. That's just one man's opinion.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Other comments? I guess I'll throw out mine while people are thinking is that I think for the first question, as far as the quality of the studies, I didn't see anything in the studies that would raise a quality concern that I think, I mean, each of them is limited in their own ways with respect to the endpoints measured, but that's not uncommon. I mean, you don't have, none of them are touted to be comprehensive assessments. And so for what they are, the way that endpoints were evaluated, sample sizes and dosing was probably appropriate. The biggest comment that might come up with this evaluation of some of the studies, especially, for example, the, just trying to make sure I got the authors correct here, the immunotoxicity with Woodliff, that was largely a negative study. And so one might question whether or not the doses used were actually high enough to produce an effect. And so they do show shifts in immune cell populations, as Tom noted, but I think the other traditional endpoints don't point to any adverse effects having been identified. So one might argue that the dosing regimen or the animals models being used, the C57 black mice, were just not sensitive enough to try to detect an effect, or they needed to go to higher doses. I think that might help inform you as you start to do the negotiations with respect to the design of the studies that are as part of the consent order. And then I think going to the second question is, do the studies provide enough scientific support utilized to develop a point of departure? I'd agree with Dr. Starr. I think the answer to that is no, they don't provide adequate data for us to be able to do that today.
Thank you.
One other comment I would make about the health study that I forgot to mention. The thought had occurred to me when I read it that this change in immune cell population distribution could be just an adaptive or a recognition response that something is different. You know, they are exposed to something. The chemicals get into the body, and it's not surprising that the immune system would be able to recognize that in some way. And maybe that's all this is, an adaptive response to the fact that they have been exposed, not necessarily an adverse response. And I think that ought to be kept in mind at this point, because we don't really have the toxicity tests that would connect up to these other kinds of findings.
I think that's a good point. Thank you.
So John, circling back to your concern, I think what we're doing right now, where they're soliciting some advice from us, might actually give them, you know, could give Franny and others at the state at least enough initial guidance to know what priority to put on things like this. I think once you start to say, you know, we're going to ask for maybe a formal document to try to review, or asking them to do work, one of the concerns I always have a little bit is, you know, people can always find more work to do, but it may not be productive work.
Right.
So I think that's maybe how I viewed this exercise, was just maybe giving them a quick ground truthing as to whether or not they're really put a lot of effort into this.
I very much appreciate that, and I agree that there's different levels of feedback we can provide, and I think the feedback that you and Tom just went through, I agree with, and that is that this type of work, I think, has promise for the future, particularly with the research that's underway now, which is pretty extensive, but it's that moving it towards actually deriving a reference dose or a cancer potency factor or something like that, reference concentration, I think it's not ready yet to get to that point, but that's what everybody wants, because it would enable us to, effectively address many more chemical concerns that we can address right now. And one of the problems we have is that in the absence of something like a reference dose or concentration or potency factor, it's essentially zero in the eyes of many, that there's no quantitative risk characterized, so therefore there's no risk. And I think that's completely wrong. So I think this is where there's a lot of interest in trying to address the multitude of chemicals that people are exposed to in the environment. This is a really important direction, but I don't know that it's yet ready for application. And I think that's kind of what Tom and Dave were both saying. So I would be in the same camp as that. But I think that is important feedback at this time. I hope that's helpful.
It is, thank you. And when I read these papers, I didn't come to really any other conclusion, but for me to make that decision without consulting any of you is presumptuous and not the right process that we should follow. And so I didn't expect really any other response, to be honest, but I did want your expert feedback. And so I do appreciate it. I know it is a chore to read papers and answer specific questions, and I do appreciate it.
I think, though, that one of the things that we might benefit from is to ask Keith how to come in and actually address some of the questions that I had put forward, which has him describe the approach, have him describe some of the strengths and limitations of it to support this discussion. Again, and where is the research community going to try to address moving it into applications from prioritization? I think prioritization, is absolutely correct, but it's what work is being done where we might be able to provide some insights on that or benefit from his insights as to where we can go with this. So I would still like to have him come in and speak to the group and engage with us.
Yeah, I would really like that as well. And I think that the new approach methods are really the way of the future in toxicology. I think it's just how soon can we apply them is a big question. So I will reach out to that group and see if I can set up a presentation for October based on your and Dr. Kenyon's questions that I received.
Good. Thank you.
This is Elena. I basically pretty much agree with the points that Tom, David, and John made. The other thing I wanted to mention, Keith Hauk retired about 2 years ago. I would recommend you reach out to Mike DeVito because he's a division director there in the Tox Center, and he is very much in the thick of all this, including the PFAS. And they're in addition to some of the, I think where they're going with the new approach methodologies in an overarching way is the consideration of both exposure, as in biomonitoring, measuring it in media like groundwater or drinking water, or in serum from biomonitoring studies. That tells you about exposure potential. And I think some of the assays that are geared towards screening large numbers of PFAS, which Keith's paper is an example of, give you some sense of, they allow you to say what do we need to be most concerned about. And of course it's with your higher bioactivity profile, presuming you've got enough NAMS coverage, and also the exposure potential. And then I also just wanted to throw out something else. There are some other types of assays that are kind of meeting in the middle between the NAMS and the apical endpoints, or the endpoints that tend to get measured in traditional tox studies. And one of those is using a short-term exposure of laboratory animals and measuring things like a transcriptomic point of departure, and then looking at where that falls relative to a point of departure you might develop from, or what critical effect you might observe for a particular PFAS. And I think there are some examples of papers where they're actually trying to do that. And I can send those to you if that is an approach, because again, it's kind of intermediate throughput, but that's an approach that's increasingly being taken by multiple groups in order to sort of establish at what point, how do we look at, what framework can we use to look at whether a particular set of PFAS or any other compounds correlate if you're doing a short-term exposure bioactivity profile, like a transcriptomic point of departure, and how does that compare to the results from more traditional animal bioassays, because it's not quite as big a technological leap, or a biological leap, more correctly.
Yeah, I would love to learn more about those. I know that there were some being done in the neurotox lab at EPA a few years ago that were kind of in the middle between the NAMs and traditional methods. But I didn't learn too much about those at the time. And so I would love if you would send me those papers, and maybe we can solicit a presentation from one of those groups as well.
So Franny, one other thing I'll point out is going back to the Hauk paper with their quality assurance checks, where they point out that there could be some issues with their analytical chemistry measurements of stock solutions. And so that might be also worth taking a look at with respect to your bioassay data that you're trying to do and the aquatic tox type studies you're trying to do to try to see where the PFAS compounds that you're looking at, planning some studies for how those might compare to what they found with respect to the stability of their stock solutions. Because I think that's something else that would be worth at least double checking.
That's a great point.
Yeah. Whether volatility is going to prove to be an issue in your final interpretation of results.
Absolutely. And that's something that we've been very careful about when we've been reviewing the methods. And I know that Dr. Kenyon mentioned that in an email to me a couple weeks ago as well. And so I'll take a closer look at that paper, but yeah, I'll be well informed when I review the protocols again.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments, suggestions, advice? Okay. All right. So for those of you that might have been joining the meeting for the afternoon session, just be aware that item 9 in our agenda, which was a presentation by Franny on the consent order toxicity studies, was actually moved to the morning portion of the meeting because of we were running a little bit ahead of time. And so we're really left with an update now, again by Franny. This is like the Franny show, on water and fish collection update, and then we'll be having a few individuals have requested the time to make some public comments. So Franny, the board, you've got our attention once again.
Thank you. So I do have a few slides, and then I think Kennedy from DHHS will also have a slide to present. Is that right? Set of slides.
So I'll probably reference some of the slides we had earlier regarding the fish consumption development, but yeah.
Okay. Okay. I just wasn't sure, but I'll give this presentation, and then we can go from there. All right. So thanks once again. Here I am. This is a presentation that I've prepared, and it is I'm really excited to give it. Actually, this is a project that Kennedy and I and some of our other state partners have worked really hard on the last several months, and I think it is it's a great project. I'm really happy to be a part of it. But so here is some information about our fish and water collection event that is going on right now. So as far as a quick project plan overview, this summer, between May and August, we have started and are underway of a large-scale fish collection event going on in the middle and lower Cape Fear rivers, and these fish and water samples will be sent for PFAS analysis. We will be collecting about 300 fish that represent migratory and non-migratory freshwater and saltwater fish that are all commonly consumed by the citizens of North Carolina. Along with these fish samples, we are also collecting water samples, which I failed to put on this slide, but the water samples are an integral part of our surface water standard development and how we calculate a bioconcentration factor. This data will serve our surface water standards development for the suite of PFAS compounds, and then the number of fish and the locations that we're using will also serve DHHS to derive fish consumption advisories if appropriate. And so we've designed this so there will be enough data to do that if necessary. These fish tissue samples and our water samples will be analyzed at the gel laboratories in South Carolina that we have been using to analyze nearly all of the consent order related samples. And so these tissue and water samples will be analyzed for the full suite of the consent order compounds, as well as any others that the method is approved for and we can trust the analytical results of. This will enable our regulatory values to be generated for these signature or consent order specific compounds once the EPA or the North Carolina Departments and Science Advisory Board derive reference doses. And so again, here is just this figure, importance of reference doses and all of the things that we use them for. This project is a huge collaborative effort, and it is certainly not any one person or department that is at the helm here. We're all working together. And so DEQ has the Division of Marine Fisheries and Water Resources very heavily involved in this project, as well as me in the Secretary's office. DHHS, their public health department, and Kennedy has been spearheading the DHHS component of this particular project. And then also the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission has been a huge help. And specifically Kyle Rachels in the Inland Fisheries Division has been really an amazing collaborator and helped us collect a great number of fish very quickly. So here's the slide again. Here it is. There's the EPA PFAS roadmap compounds on one side and the consent order specific or non-EPA roadmap compounds on the other side. Again, colors denote legacy or consent order related compounds. These are the suite of compounds that these tissue and water samples will be analyzed for, and also including any others that the method is appropriate and approved for. This is a map of the Cape Fear River, and this is our study site and our locations for our fish and water collection project. And so I'll orient you before I go into detail about what the different things mean. In the center of the white map, top center, there is a gray shape, and that is the Fayetteville Works facility. Along the right side of that particular shape, there is a blue line, and that is the Cape Fear River. And so the Cape Fear River runs alongside of that facility and then flows down through the state in a southeasterly fashion to the confluence with the Atlantic Ocean. The river spans a number of counties, and there are a lot of different features along the river that we have mentioned in a lot of different documents and presentations, like the lock and dams, wastewater treatment facilities, other things. And so here, oh, I'm sorry, the gray polygon is Fayetteville. That's not Fayetteville Works. If you look closely in Can you see my mouse, or am I mousing over this just for myself? No? Okay.
Yeah, we
You
can
can
see it.
it. If you look in this section 10, this light green color, there's the Chemours property boundary. So this little polygon here is the Fayetteville Works facility. I'm sorry, I was confused. That is Chemours. And so our intention here was to sample the river from the site of known contamination throughout the length of the river to the confluence with the Atlantic Ocean. We've divided the river, and this is a 200-kilometer section of the river. We've divided this into 10 different sections, and these are 20-kilometer sections. In each of these sections, different species of fish that I'll get into in a minute are being collected. And that way we can monitor the PFAS or any other contaminants that are being accumulated into these different species of fish in proximity and then many kilometers away from the facility in question. We're also collecting water samples from all of these locations, and that way we can derive a bioaccumulation factor for each of these compounds that are specific to Chemours and also the ones that the EPA is deriving reference doses for. I think that's all I have to say about this map, but let me walk back to it. Just for a quick refresher for anyone that wasn't here in the morning, a bioaccumulation or a bioconcentration factor is just an indicator of a chemical substance to accumulate in a living organism. And this is generally expressed as a ratio of a concentration of a chemical in an organism and then in its environment. And so here we have fish and water samples, and those two will be put into an equation together to derive the factor. It's a measure of the extent of the chemical moving between the organism and its environment, and a value greater than 1 is generally indicative of accumulation. And so that is what we are trying to derive by collecting water and fish samples throughout the Cape Fear River. As far as the species we're collecting, we have kind of a split between the more freshwater portion of the river and then the estuarine and more saline portion of the river closer to the ocean. And so in sections 10 through 4, these top 7 sections that are entirely or close to entirely freshwater, we're collecting 5 species of fish from every one of these sites. And so those are here on the left, and they are largemouth bass, bluegill and red-eared sunfish, and then blue and flathead catfish. These will be collected from all of these sites. We're also opportunistically sampling the species on the right side of the slide. And so they are American shad, striped bass, and channel catfish. And those are being collected when they are present, when they can be collected. The American shad are migratory in the river, and so they're not represented in each of the sites all summer long. Striped bass is the same. Those are hatchery fish, and they are put into the river in the beginning of the season and then generally fished out nearly entirely. And so we collected those from the sites where we could find them. And then channel catfish were opportunistic when they were found. As far as the bottom 3 locations of the river, and so these are more salty and they have more marine species than the other 3 sites. And so we have a different array of species we're collecting. And they are striped bass, southern flounder, speckled trout, black and red drum, and then also sheep's head. And we've also collected croaker from one site because they were present and people do eat them. And so we are collecting a lot of different fish for this study. As far as our progress is concerned, we've collected a lot of fish so far. And so the top 7 sites of the river, so from Chemours to the point in the river where it turns into a more estuarine or salty environment, those sites have been completely sampled, and we've collected 5 fish of each species at each location, with the exception of 2. And so there are these yellow cells here, and the river has just gotten too warm at this point, and we could not find the last individual of the sunfish or the last 3 largemouth bass. I was on the river for 8 hours and I could not find those fish. And so we are going to try to go out again in September when the water is a little cooler and those fish might come back to the surface. But even without them, we have a very impressive number of fish from that portion of the river, and they should give us a lot of really great information about the way PFAS are moving through the environment. The bottom 3 sites are still in progress, and this is because the summer is here and it's quite hot, and so it is more difficult to collect these fish. The Division of Marine Fisheries is also collecting these during their normal operations, and so they have 2 different studies that they do monitoring throughout the summer, and our fish are just being selected when they make themselves available in their netting practices. And so it's a little bit slower, but these 3 sites are actively being sampled now. So far, we have almost 230 fish have been collected and filleted in our lab, and they're awaiting the next step, which would be homogenization and sending them to the laboratory for analysis. As far as our timeline goes, we got the okay for this project in April and scurried and designed our project as quickly as we could and got all of our different partners on board. Fish collection started the first week of June, and so when we had the last SAB meeting, I had just delivered the supplies to our field collectors, but no fish had been collected yet. And so all of these fish have been collected in just under 2 months. And we're anxiously awaiting the rest of our fish from those lower 3 sections, but they're underway, certainly. We've been processing the fish in the lab, and that is a completely PFAS-free processing method. And so everything is clean and rinsed with methanol to remove PFAS. Everything is done in a way that should not contaminate anything. We have lots of blanks to make sure that happens. And then everything is frozen. And so the next step is to homogenize all of those this next month and send them to the laboratory for analysis. We're hoping to get the data back in the fall and do regulatory development in the late part of the year, and more than likely 2023. This is Kyle Rachels from the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission. He has been a huge help in collecting all of those fish from 7 sections of the river. This is what fish processing looks like in the Marine Fisheries Lab. This is Jeff DeBardinas, and he runs the fish tissue collection program at DEQ. And here he is filleting a blue catfish, which is one of those target species we have from every site along the river. And then as far as the data review goes, this will happen when we get the data back. And this is our intern, Miles Dillard. He was a great help all summer and driving to Wilmington and picking up a lot of fish with very, very short notice most of the time. Yeah, and that's it. That's all that I have. And so, Kennedy, you're welcome to chime in however you like.
Yeah, I'll just kind of add on kind of to what you were saying. So how we fit in DHHS to this whole process is one, as far as the study design goes, I know Frank touched on a bit with the 10 sections of the river, but one of the reasons we approached and wanted to do it in kind of a sectional methodology is typically our fish consumption advisories are site specific when we develop them at DHHS, because typically they revolve around lakes or other kind of contained water bodies. And so looking at the Cape Fear River, especially once we consulted with the fish ecologists and experts at wildlife resources and with marine fisheries, and understanding how fish move within these water bodies, we wanted to make sure that if we conducted this process, we could look at the Cape Fear River holistically and not just at one specific point of the river, because from community feedback and concerns, that wouldn't really be very helpful if we were only able to look at one part of the river. And so looking at other work that's been done around the country, we had seen that some states, such as Wisconsin, had kind of looked at sectional ways of looking and evaluating different fish in their rivers and water bodies. And so we kind of modeled some of the sections based upon the traveling, the expected travel, I guess, window of travel for fish in terms of how far they travel but also try and create that sectional methodology so we can look at each section and then kind of as needed potentially kind of link the sections together as we potentially if we're looking at fish consumption advisories, if something gets flagged, we can kind of make the river whole as we go through this whole process and look at the data here. And then also as far as how we are evaluating and doing the development of fish consumption advisories or screening them and looking at them, we are using reference doses that are established out there in the literature. So I know we've heard a lot over the last couple months about the new EPA health advisories and the RFDs, the reference doses that go into developing those. And so those were reference doses that would be used in these types of calculations for milk consumptions. But then also, as Franny pointed out, there are a lot of other PFAS compounds that are being analyzed in these fish. So for other compounds that may be analyzed that have not been addressed specifically by the EPA in their current scope of work, things that such as PFNA, PFHXS, and some of the other PFAS that other states have developed reference doses for, such as Michigan, I know has developed advisories and done some work on reference doses for some of these other compounds. We will be looking at those as well, because we want to be able to look at this data set as completely as we can as possible and be able to provide information to folks based on what we're seeing in this this data set, and especially because some of these PFAS compounds really haven't been looked at in fish extensively to date so far. So we want to try to be as all encompassing as possible here. And then one last thing I just kind of want to put out there, and it's something I just remind people of, not to mitigate our own work or anything like that, but for this fish consumption advisory work, I just want to remind people that we already do have fish consumption advisories that are applicable to various species in the Cape Fear and across the state as well, such as mercury advisories, PCBs, and inorganic metals as well, in places across the state and in the Cape Fear region as well in specific areas. And so I always tell people that even though we're looking at this work and we don't know what's to come of it yet because we haven't seen the data, but that there already are advisors in place. And even if something is found there, these advisories may not be stricter than what is already in place for some of these species that are already out there. So I just want people to keep that front and center of their mind, because there are things that are already impacting the fish in these areas and kind of tailoring our current recommendations. So I just kind of want to leave it with that one reminder as well.
Okay. So I had one question. You putting in a lot of effort developing methods for doing tissue concentrations in fish. Have there been any thought about applying those to the aquatic tox study to try to look at filleting those fish as well, you'd get more dose response data and then maybe be able to further interpret what you're finding in Cape Fear River?
That's a good question. And so I think that the aquatic tox studies that are being done as part of the consent order with Comores, and they're being done at Eurofins, they're going to more than likely be done using zebrafish. And so they're not going to be really large enough fish to fillet.
Well, sometimes people use bass. That's been a species used for aquatic tox too. So I was curious about that. Okay. Any other questions or comments from the board? Okay, well, we look forward to updates here in the near future. All right, thanks, Franny. You're 3 for 3. All right, so Dylan, I have a question for you. I've been monitoring the attendee list, and I don't see anyone that self-identified that wanted to present to the board actually here in attendance. That's our last item on the agenda. Are you aware of anybody who actually signed up to present to the board being on the call today?
Let me do one more brief check real quick, just in case. That is correct. I do not see anybody, and I do not have any other knowledge of more of the public participants.
Okay. So I'll just open it up for the board if there's any other items people would like to discuss that just didn't fall onto the agenda. Okay, hearing none. I'm going to ask for a motion to adjourn.
So moved. This is John Vandenberg.
Thank you, John. Anybody willing to second?
Yes, I second the
Okay,
motion.
thank you. All right. Thank you. Any other comments? And we're adjourned. Thank you. We'll see you here in the near future. And have a nice rest of your day. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much,
Yeah.
David, and thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.